Islam All Too Human. This is Part 14, Muhammad's Authority. This is Aben al-Hurriya, Son of Freedom. Purpose of this study: to establish the very human character of Islam, to show that many characteristics we see in early Islam can be attributed to human causes, thus denying the supernatural origin of Islam. Therefore, we can show that Islam is merely a human invention. Therefore, the commands and regulations imposed on Muslims by Sharia law carry no divine authority. As a consequence, Muslims have been deceived into believing a lie. If Muslims have the courage to face the evidence for the mere human origin of Islam, they can be freed from their bondage. This will have the effect of weakening Islamic imperialism, kinetic and civilization jihad. This will have the effect of promoting world peace. Evidences for Muhammad's prophethood. Here are the references that you see on the screen. I'm using Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq is the earliest and most authoritative source for the biography of Muhammad, but the hard work has to be done to pull together the sources of Ibn Ishaq from various manuscripts, which has been done by especially Guillaume, the Oxford University Press version from 1987, but also Michael Edwards translated the same works, but his is an abridged version. And then of course there's Hadith literature that I'm going to reference, and the Quran itself, and then the so-called History of al-Tabari, which is online in English in 40 volumes. Okay, let's start with data that suggests that Muhammad was a true prophet. These are the evidences that are given to us by the Islamic sources. Right, 14.1. Prophetic signs attending Muhammad's birth. It is reported that while the mother of Muhammad was carrying him in the womb, a light issued from her, dare I ask from where, which illuminated even the castles of Busra, Syria. Question 1. Could this be a marker that suggests that Islam originated in Syria rather than in Mecca? And this has been suggested by revisionist scholars. Remark: this story seems incredible. How long did this last? If this really happened, one would expect that it would draw a great deal of attention, but we seem to never hear about it again. Question 2. Is this Muhammad's adaptation of the Star of David attending the birth of Jesus? Matthew chapter 2 verses 9 and 10. Muhammad's mother reports that her pregnancy is exceptionally light. She says that when Muhammad was born, he placed his hands on the ground and looked up to heaven. 2. Bad omen to the Jews. At the time of Muhammad's birth, it is reported that a Jew called together a group of other Jews and announced to them from a flat roof of a house in Medina, "Woe to you! What is the matter? This night the star has risen, under which the apostle is born." Remark: this seems to be Muhammad's reply to the account of the Star of David attending Jesus' birth. It combines the phenomenon of the star with the opposite message to the Jews. In the announcement of Jesus as the Messiah, the news was meant to bring glad tidings to the Jews. In announcing the birth of Muhammad, a clearly anti-Semitic message seems to be back-read into the history. 3. Muhammad's name assigned by Allah. Muhammad's mother, Amina bint Wahb, claims that Muhammad's name had been assigned to her to give him. This is akin to Jehovah's naming Jesus and naming John the Baptist. The idea of the deity assigning the child's name seems borrowed from the New Testament account. The snow visitation, number 4. While Muhammad and his milk brother are pasturing animals, 2 men approach them. They are wearing white garments. They take hold of Muhammad, open his belly, extract his heart, split it open, and take out a black lump of blood. They throw away the black lump of blood and wash his heart and belly with snow until they have purified them. Then they weigh him twice and he is heavier than 100 and 1,000 people. They decide he would be heavier than the whole nation. Muhammad also took his pasturing sheep as a sign of authentication. Question: what percentage of all shepherds in history turned out to be prophets? Five, testimony by the soothsayer visiting Mecca. When having seen the young Muhammad, this soothsayer says that Muhammad will have high dignity. 6. Testimony by the Christian monk in Busra, Syria. This monk, named Bahira, reported having seen a vision in which Muhammad's caravan had stopped and a cloud had overshadowed a tree near the apostle, and the branches bent themselves over the prophet so as to protect him. To accommodate Muhammad's people, this monk had said, quote, I abjure you by Allah and Al-Uzza to answer my questions. End quote. Muhammad replies that he despises these two gods. After questioning Muhammad, the monk discovers the seal of prophecy between his shoulders. This monk warns Muhammad's uncle Abu Talib to protect him from the Jews because they will try to injure him. The monk also predicts that something great will happen to him. 7. Warning by an angel to be modest. While Muhammad is with some of his Quraysh companions, they decide to carry stones in their loincloths, ezers, which they had put around their necks. But an unknown being approached and struck a fearful blow to Muhammad and warned him to cover his private parts with the ezar. 8. Testimony by another monk in Syria. This seems to be a second monk during another journey after Muhammad had married Khadijah. Question: could this be a second account of the same monk? It's not clear. While accompanied by wife Khadijah's slave Maysara, Muhammad sits down beneath a tree near the hermitage of a monk. The monk testifies that nobody has ever sat beneath this particular tree who was not a prophet. On the way back from this trip, Maysara is made to testify that he saw two angels shading Muhammad while on the camel. Khadijah's cousin Waraka, upon Muhammad's return to Mecca, hears Maysara and testifies that Muhammad must be the prophet of his people. The intent of these stories of the two Syrian monks seems to be that even Christian leaders acknowledge the prophethood of Muhammad. 9. Authenticating discovery while refurbishing the Kaaba. When the Quraysh tribe decided to demolish and rebuild the Kaaba, while demolishing it, they encountered an inscription in Syriac. Fortunately, a Jew nearby could translate it for them. The inscription said, I am Allah, the Lord of Mecca. I created it when I created the heavens and earth. When I fashioned the sun and the moon, and I have appointed over it 7 angels, Mecca will not perish until its 2 hills perish. It will be blessed to its inhabitants in water and milk. This is taken to be the finger of Allah in the founding of Mecca. 10. Gabriel's first appearance to Muhammad. Ibn Ishaq recounts Gabriel's first appearance to Muhammad. Muhammad reports that Gabriel, an angel, commanded him to read some writing on a brocade. He commanded Muhammad 3 times. Each time Muhammad said that he could not read, so the angel squeezed him. On the 3rd time, Muhammad miraculously is able to read the brocade. From this time, Muhammad begins to go to all the tribes and people of the local area and declare that only his particular monotheism is correct and that only he speaks for that deity. He also declares that his revelation is in the tradition of, but a corrective to, Judaism and Christianity. Both are reinterpreted as a sort of proto-Islam that went awry. 11. Observations on Muhammad's ministry. It is conspicuous in the early parts of the Quran and in Ibn Ishaq's biography that the Quran is mentioned as if it is already a complete book, even in the early Meccan period. This suggests that back editing is at work in the accretion of Islamic tradition. It is also conspicuous that in the biography of Muhammad, he had a significant credibility problem with his own tribe, the Quraysh. From the beginning of his first alleged revelation, Muhammad's modus operandus was to claim that there is only one God, that he, Muhammad, is that God's only living prophet, and that the character and nature of that God is what Muhammad says it is. He continuously and forcefully claimed that only his deity was the true deity. From early on, these two central claims were attended by increasing levels of force as Muhammad acquired political and military power. 12. Testimony to Aisha from Muhammad on the nature of his revelations. Aisha said, "O Allah's Messenger, how is the divine inspiration revealed to you?" Notice that Muhammad has Aisha trained to address her husband as the prophet. That is one of the advantages of marrying a 9-year-old girl. You can mold her. Muhammad answers, "Sometimes it is revealed like the ringing of a bell. This form of inspiration is hardest of all, and then this state passes off after I have grasped what is inspired. Sometimes the angel comes in the form of a man and talks to me, and I grasp whatever he says." Aisha says, "Verily I saw the prophet being inspired divinely, and noticed the sweat dropping from his forehead on a very cold day as the inspiration was over." 13. More testimony from Muhammad. Quote, "The commencement of the divine inspiration to Allah's Messenger was in the form of righteous true dreams, which came true like bright daylight." This is from Bukhari 1.3. When Muhammad first experienced his revelations, he was gripped with fear. Muhammad's wife's cousin, Waraka, predicted that Muhammad's revelations would cause the people to drive him out of Mecca. This appears to be an after-the-fact occurrence, presented as a prediction. Elsewhere in Bukhari, it is reported that Gabriel appeared to Muhammad and warned him to stay away from idols. Khadijah was one of the primary reporters of signs that Muhammad had received revelations. 14. Regular appearances by Gabriel. Bukhari reports that Gabriel used to meet with Muhammad every night during Ramadan and teach him the Quran. Notice that Ramadan seems to be a pre-existing institution. Question: if the Quran is an eternal book that Allah sent down from the 7 heavens, then why would Allah transmit it piecemeal through dictation to an unlettered outside sales rep? The accounts say that the Quran was written in pieces on all manner of media, wood, stone, leather, parchment, etc. That may explain why the Quran is so choppy and hardly contains any narrative. There seems to be much more opportunity for surahs to get lost or obliterated through transmission. If the Quran is eternal, as Muslims say, why couldn't Allah not just send it in one written installment by FedEx or email attachment or their 7th century counterparts or equivalent? Jehovah gave Moses the 10 Commandments in one written piece, and when Moses got angry and broke the tablets, Jehovah even gave him a backup copy. Not so Allah. 15. The Quraysh are vexed about Muhammad's credentials. They confer about Muhammad and wonder whether he is a soothsayer, whether he is possessed by jinns, or whether he is a poet. They finally decide that he's a sorcerer, because he has come with words which are sorcery and which separate a man from his father or from his brother, from his wife or from his family. This quotation seems eerily similar to Jesus' warning in Matthew chapter 10, verses 34 and 35. "Think not that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I came not to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law." Like maybe it was borrowed. I hypothesize that Muhammad has borrowed this statement by Jesus and put it into the mouths of the Quraysh to signal that he is of similar stature to Jesus. Note that the Quraysh are vexed by Muhammad, that they feel threatened by Muhammad's quest for power and say so. 16. One of the Quraysh, Abu Jahl, offers to kill Muhammad with a rock, but when he tries to do so, a stallion camel appeared before me with a skull, a collarbone, and teeth like of which I have never seen. It rushed to devour me. But I guess it didn't follow through because he lived to report it to us. This is supposed to be taken to mean that Allah was protecting Muhammad. Why would the God of the universe, the author of the Big Bang, and the designer of the DNA, threaten one of Muhammad's detractors with a camel with big teeth? It seems so 7th century. Doesn't this point to the human origins of the story? 17. The story of the cave. Since the Quraysh were vexed about Muhammad, they sent al-Nadir and Uqba to the Jewish priests of Medina, reasoning that they would be able to help determine whether Muhammad was a true prophet. The Jewish priests had them ask Muhammad 3 test questions. Rather than answer them directly, Muhammad deflects them onto the story of the 3 boys in the cave. Muhammad appears to quote the Apostle James from the New Testament when he says, "Say not of anything, I shall do this tomorrow," without adding, "if Allah wills." This appears to be one of the many cases where Muhammad invokes Allah's name to avoid answering a question. If the story of the cave were true, Muhammad would be citing a miracle in that the boys stayed in the cave 309 years. But there is no compelling reason to believe it, and what is the point of hiding in the cave 309 years anyway? 18. Muhammad's encounter with Rukana. Rukana is reputed to be the strongest of the Quraysh, while he is accompanied by Muhammad. Muhammad, during their conversation, is trying to win over Rukana to his religion. He asks Rukana if Rukana will believe his claims if Muhammad were to knock him down. Rukana says yes, whereupon Muhammad knocks him to the ground helpless, even twice. So much for reasoned persuasion. Then Muhammad purportedly orders a tree to remove itself and present itself to him, and the tree supposedly does so. Then Muhammad orders the tree back to its place and it returns. This encounter is intended to be a demonstration of Muhammad's power. But how convincing is it? 19. Gabriel has Muhammad's back. The Quraysh were so frustrated at Muhammad's grasp for power that they put various types of boycott on him to stymie him. On one occasion, there was an incident involving 5 mockers. Mockers means that not only did they not accept Muhammad's prophetic claims, but heaped scorn on him. So while these 5 mockers are circumambulating the Kaaba, Gabriel comes to Muhammad's aid and inflicts them with various physical ailments such as blindness, dropsy, infection, and poisoning. The moral of this story seems to be, don't insult the prophet. Well, that message has stuck. Notice that Muhammad's response to rejection is the opposite of that of Jesus. Jesus did not invoke angels to give payback to the scribes and Pharisees. In fact, Jesus said to turn the other cheek when somebody insults you. Not so Muhammad. 20. The night journey, just like the Transfiguration. While Muhammad is sleeping, Gabriel has to kick him 3 times, and on the 3rd time, Gabriel takes Muhammad by the arm to the mosque. Somebody slices Muhammad open from throat to pubic area, then his heart is removed. A gold tray full of belief is brought to him. His heart is washed and replaced. It is interesting here that the mosque, as a religious place, seems to be well established, even during Muhammad's ministry, which suggests that mosques antedate Islam. At the mosque, Gabriel presents Muhammad with a special mount, an animal called the Buraq. This animal is a cross between a mule and a donkey. It has wings. This animal had supernatural characteristics. It could stretch its legs to and from the horizon. It naturally had wings, even wings on its forelegs. Its face was handsome, and differing accounts are divided on whether the creature was male or female. This animal figure is conspicuously similar to creatures from the Persian and Indian myths. Gabriel escorts Muhammad while he rides this animal to the seven heavens. They are occupied by 1. Adam, 2. John the Baptist and Jesus, 3. Joseph, 4. Enoch, 5. Aaron, 6. Moses, and 7. Abraham. At each heaven, Gabriel is challenged. Have you been sent for? Gabriel's answer is yes. At the second through the sixth heaven, the figures John the Baptist and Jesus, Joseph, Enoch, Aaron, and Moses address Muhammad as pious brother and pious prophet. At the first and seventh heaven, Adam and Abraham address Muhammad as pious son and pious prophet. This is meant to signal that Muhammad ranks with these biblical figures. Notice Muhammad's denial of anything outstanding about Jesus. This is meant to deny the divinity of Jesus found in Christian theology. During his visit to Moses, Moses weeps and says that it is because more of Muhammad's followers will enter paradise than followers of Moses. So Muhammad sees himself as greater than even Moses. Then Muhammad is brought to a place called the Lot tree of the utmost boundary. This tree, not surprisingly, had ears as big as an elephant, as elephant leaves, and fruit like the bars of Hajar. Like the jars of Hajar. Then Muhammad is shown 4 rivers, 2 visible and 2 invisible. The 2 invisible rivers are in paradise, and the 2 visible rivers are the Nile and the Euphrates. Then Muhammad is shown the sacred house. Evidently, Allah resides in a house. Perhaps this would mean that the Kaaba is meant to be a symbol of this heavenly house. Muhammad is told 70,000 angels enter the house each day. Then he is presented with wine, milk, and honey. When he took the milk, Gabriel likens the milk to his Islamic religion. He is praised for rejecting wine, and this becomes a law to Muslims. Then Muhammad is enjoined to take 50 prayers per day. All references to Allah in the story are indirect, as an impersonal voice. On his way back, Moses asked Muhammad what he was told to do. When Muhammad tells Moses about the 50 prayer a day requirement, Moses advises that Muhammad asks a reduction by 10 prayers. Repeat. Muhammad obeys and is thus able to get the number of prayers reduced to 40, 30, then 10, then 5. Here the story ends. This account of Muhammad, Moses, and a shadow, Allah, is conspicuously similar to the story of Abraham's exchange regarding the fate of Sodom. There, Abraham seeks to stay Jehovah's hand of judgment over the sins of Sodom. It is reasonable to hypothesize that Muhammad got the idea for this part of the night journey from the account in Genesis 18, and the idea of a night journey from the Gospels account of the transfiguration of Jesus. The purpose of the night journey is to certify to Muslims that Muhammad is classed among the patriarchs of the Old Testament, that his instructions about Allah can be trusted, that he has received instructions directly from Allah. This same Muhammad, who shamelessly borrows stories and imagery from the Jews, later in his ministry condemns the Jews, even denying that the Old Testament is a faithful representation of the original Torah. 21. Muhammad blinds his would-be assassins just like with Lot. Just prior to his immigrating from Mecca to Medina, Muhammad was the object of an assassination attempt by his own tribe, the Quraysh, whom he had alienated with his prophetic claims. The ringleader of this attempt was one Abu Jahl. He wanted one assassin chosen from each of the tribes to participate in the killing of Muhammad, so that the Muslims would have to take on everyone else and would be outnumbered. While they lay in wait at Muhammad's front door, Muhammad has Ali sleep in his bed, assuring him that Abu Jahl's helpers would not think that he is Muhammad. When Muhammad hears his assailants jeering him at his door, he throws dust at them and blinds them so that they cannot see to kill him, and he walks away. This stratagem on the part of Muhammad is strikingly similar to the story of Lot just before Sodom and Gomorrah. In the story of Lot, Lot invites two angels to stay as guests in his home. The men of Sodom come to his door to demand that Lot turn his guests out to them. While Lot is on his front porch negotiating with these wicked men, his angelic guests blind the men so they cannot find Lot's door. The idea of blinding his assassins at his door seems too similar to its counterpart in the story of Lot of Genesis 19 to think that it is a coincidence. 22. Replacing a warrior's eye during the Battle of Uhud. During the Battle of Uhud, one of Muhammad's fighters, Qatada, had been injured in the eye so that it hung out of his socket upon his cheek. But Muhammad replaced the eye in the socket with his own hand so that it became Qatada's better eye. 23. Muhammad uses spit to soften soil. Jesus uses spit to heal the blind and the deaf. During the Battle of the Trench, the Muslims were warned that the Quraysh tribe had come out of Mecca to attack the Muslims who are now based in Medina. To prepare a defense, Muhammad directed that a trench be dug around Medina. However, some of the soil was rocky, so that his soldiers had difficulty breaking the rocks with their picks. Muhammad asked that a vessel of water be brought to him. He spit into the vessel of water, and when the water was poured on the hard soil, it became like a sand heap, and resisted neither pickaxe nor hoe. This seems borrowed from three instances where Jesus is said to apply his spit to the ground or on a person to heal the blind, and to heal the deaf and dumb. 24. Muhammad feeds the multitudes too, just like Jesus. During the Battle of the Trench, it is reported that Muhammad had dates poured into his hands. Then he ordered a cloth to be spread before him. When he placed the dates on the cloth, they multiplied so that they fed all the workers, and the dates were still overflowing the sides of the cloth. During the Battle of the Trench, also, one lamb was used to feed all the workers. After Muhammad pronounced grace on one lamb, it fed all the men. These two miracles seem interestingly similar to the gospel stories of Jesus' feeding of the multitude. 25. Allah helps Muhammad defeat the Qurayza tribe. The Banu Qurayza and the Ghatafan tribes negotiated over forming a united front against Muhammad and his soldiers. Ibn Ishaq reports that it was Allah that caused a mistrust between these two tribes, and that caused them to fail to form a united front that might have succeeded in routing Muhammad. The account also says that Allah made a strong wind to blow over their cooking pots and tents. 26. Muhammad miraculously provides water just like Moses. In the 6th year of the Hijrah, Muhammad decided to make a pilgrimage to Mecca. During this pilgrimage, his camel dropped to its knees. Although his companions said his camel was obstinate, Muhammad denied this and took the camel's action to direct him to make camp, so he directed his pilgrims to make camp. When his companions complained of the lack of water, Muhammad pulls an arrow out and directs a companion to pierce the dried up water hole with the arrow tip, whereupon the water hole yielded so much water that it supplied all his entourage. This miracle seems to have been borrowed from similar miracles found in Exodus 17 and Numbers 20, in which Moses strikes a rock with his staff and it yields water for the children of Israel. 27. The trees and stones confess that he is the apostle of Allah. This is found in Edwards 36 and 37. While Muhammad is conducting business as he was passing through some deep valleys, Ibn Ishaq reports that the very trees and stones confessed, "Salutation to thee, O Apostle of Allah." When he looked around, Muhammad saw nothing but trees and stones. Data that suggest that Muhammad was not a true prophet. 28. Revelations of convenience. Muhammad's revelation from Allah to his guests to not come early or linger after a meal. Quran 33:53. Allah's revelation that Muhammad indeed has permission to marry Zainab, his adoptive son's wife. After the Zainab affair, Allah decides to bring a revelation to Muhammad that would retroactively affect his relationship to Zainab's now ex-husband and Muhammad's adoptive son Zaid. Quote, "And he, that is Allah, has not made your claimed, that is adopted sons, your true sons, that is merely your saying by your mouths. But Allah says the truth, and He guides to the right way. Call them," that is, the adopted children, "by the names of their fathers. It is more just in the sight of Allah. But if you do not know their fathers, they are your brothers in religion." End quote. Because of this revelation, it was codified in Islamic law that formal adoption is no longer allowed. Giving the child your name or part of your estate now became haram in Islam. This seems to be the recasting into a revelation what would be the natural distancing of relations between Muhammad and Zaid, due to Muhammad's disingenuous acquiring of Zaid's wife, Zainab. And to cover his tracks, Muhammad has Allah say that there is no sin on you concerning that in which you made a mistake. Presumably the mistake here was taking Zaid as an adoptive son in the first place, not the taking of his wife as one's own wife. To put it in other words, to those who might impugn Muhammad's character by his marrying his adoptive son's wife, Muhammad could now say, "He was never my son. See, Allah says so." This part of the story is often missed. 29. Muhammad promises booty. While the preparation for the Battle of the Trench was in progress, the Banu Quraysh and the Ghatafan tribes amassed nearby. Also, word was out that the Banu Qurayza was reported to have quit their treaty with Muhammad. At this time, among his followers, there was a quip in the air. Muhammad used to promise us that he would swallow the treasures of Croesus and of Caesar, but at this moment no one of us can even feel safe when he goes out to relieve himself. This offhanded remark by Muhammad's soldiers raises an issue about the character of Muhammad's prophetic office. What kind of prophet makes a boast of swallowing the treasures of distant rulers? Is it a prophet who brings the sublime message of how to know and how to follow the one true God? Or is it a prophet who uses the name of God to justify the pursuit of power and wealth? 30. Raiding caravans and then invoking Allah for it. Early on in his career, Muhammad began the practice of raiding caravans. The Quraysh tribe became weary of Muhammad's claim to be a prophet of the only true God. They became weary of what appeared to be a theological justification for what seemed to be a grab for power and wealth. So they finally drove him out of Mecca. So in retaliation, Muhammad attacked several caravans en route to Mecca. Plundering caravans became Muhammad's gateway drug to violence and being a warlord. Later, Muhammad would raid cities. Muhammad was challenged for having killed during the sacred months, so he comes out with a revelation that this had taken place because the Muslims were being persecuted by the Quraysh and being prevented from approaching the Kaaba. Quote, "They ask you concerning the sacred month about fighting in it. Say, fighting in it is a grave matter, and hindering men from Allah's way and denying Him and hindering men from the sacred mosque and turning its people out of it are still graver with Allah, and persecution is graver than slaughter." End quote. Here is another revelation that makes murder less of a crime than blocking Muhammad's passage. It is just another revelation of convenience. 31. Summary of Muhammad's career as a warlord. According to Ibn Ishaq, Muhammad was physically present in 27 raids. So I will let you read these off the screen. Here's the first, looks like 8 or 9. Here are more of the raids. Here are more of the raids. These are raids in which Muhammad was physically present. Now these are raids in which Muhammad wielded a sword. Badr, Uhud, and Al-Ta'if, Al-Khandak, Al-Mustalik, Khaybar, the occupation of Mecca, and Hunayn, and Qurayza. I want to make some remarks on the attack on the Qurayza. In this 25-day siege, Muhammad directs the beheading of 600 to 900 men and one woman. Before the Qurayza were murdered, and during their siege, their leader, Ka'b, is reported to have said to his fellows, "We can obey this man and believe in him, for it is plain that he is an inspired prophet. In this case, your lives, your property, and children will be secure." The rest of the Qurayza replied to him, "We shall never abandon the commandments of the Torah, nor substitute any others for them." They chose to die obedient to Jehovah rather than to live on their knees to Muhammad. In addition, Guillaume reports that Muhammad ordered an additional 35 attacks. I've been able to identify 31 of them in Guillaume's text, so I won't read them off the screen. You can read them off the screen. So here are the first 7. Here are 8 through 14. You can pause if you want to read. 15 to 22. And then 23 to 31. These are raids ordered by Muhammad. The Wikipedia article based on Montgomery Watt's Muhammad in Medina lists a total of 28 expeditions in which Muhammad participated. Another 73 expeditions were directed by Muhammad but carried out by his captains. This totals 101 attacks of some sort. More modern historians tend to have a tally which is higher and presumably more complete than Ibn Ishaq. But by any measure, Muhammad's career must be viewed through the lens of his modus operandus of making war on the peoples of the Arabian Peninsula. Unless Muslim apologists can show decisively that Muhammad was indeed a true prophet of the only true God, and the only true God directed these aggressions, a reasonable alternative hypothesis is that Muhammad's thirst for power was unquenchable, and that his religion was a mere tool to control people to do his bidding. How does Islamic doctrine justify or rationalize making war on the various peoples of the Arabian Peninsula of that day, and by extension making war on the non-Islamic world in the present day? Pay attention, you Harbis. If you are not a Muslim, you are a part of the Dar al-Harb, the House of War, the object of future Islamic conquest. Muhammad claimed that a strict monotheism was the only correct philosophical theology. Then recall in Reliance of the Traveler, section A1, that Sharia law makes it illegal to engage in philosophy, and by extension philosophical theology. But methodology of science and logic were okay. Those were exceptions in Sharia law. This means that only monotheism, and only the monotheism defined by Muhammad, is correct and legal. Any other philosophical theology is rendered not just incorrect, but illegal, not just to believe, but to even discuss, according to Sharia law. And no further speculation or human reasoning is allowed. This is the definition of intellectual tyranny. This renders the particular monotheism of Muhammad a weapon with which he and future Islamic actors could bludgeon the world. And as you can see above, that he did. During Muhammad's early career, during the Meccan period, he was beleaguered. The Quraysh finally got tired of his demands for obedience and drove him out. During the Medinan period, he had acquired sufficient political and military power to carry out his ambitions. Muhammad's modus operandus evolved from persuasion to robbing caravans to finally attacking cities. His doctrine tracked his modus operandus so that the doctrine of jihad became more and more offensive and not just defensive. So that now the Islamic doctrine of dawah, mission, includes the use of military force and political warfare as a means of taking land. In Muhammad's theology, as in Islamic theology, any people who resist the invitation to Islam are under Allah's judgment and deserve death. Any secular or non-Islamic government is viewed in Islam as illegitimate and enslaving people. Jihad is the divine mechanism for freeing people from oppression to serve Allah. The Islamic doctrine of dawah, mission, views kinetic and political warfare as creating the social conditions favorable for preaching. Obey or death. Although to a Westerner, jihad seems to be an evil aspect of Islam, in Islamic theology, jihad is not only a righteous act, but an act of worship. At this juncture, we are presented with two main choices as to the interpretation of Muhammad's authority. 1. Muhammad's claim to be a prophet of the only living God is true, and the monotheism containing the particular set of doctrines in Islam represents the only correct representation of that living God. Or 2. Muhammad was a false prophet. In this case, since he appears to be quite an adroit tactician and revisionist, it is likely that the set of doctrines which he developed, which became Islam, he developed to support his political ambitions, his ambitions for power and wealth. Choice 2 is further divided into two sub-choices. 2a, Muhammad was deluded in his belief that he was an authentic prophet, or 2b, Muhammad knowingly deceived the world with his pretense of being a prophet. The intent of this presentation is to rule out choice number 1, namely, the totality of the evidence points to the more probable likelihood that Muhammad was a false prophet. The question, choices 2a and 2b, arises as to whether Muhammad was deluded. That is, did he have delusions of grandeur? It is true that we have accounts in the Hadith, in the Sirah, to the effect that Muhammad had suicidal ideation following some of his revelatory episodes. From the accounts we are presented, Muhammad almost needs to be convinced by his wife Khadija and Khadija's cousin Waraka that he is indeed a prophet, which constructs him as a reluctant prophet. A reluctant prophet is more credible than an eager prophet. If Muhammad was a true prophet, then all the murder, pillage, and suffering which he committed on the peoples of the Arabian Peninsula had divine authority. The Islamic sources present to us the justification that the killing and conquest is necessary in order for Islam to take lands and purify them for Allah. Muhammad's modus operandus was to announce to people, starting with the Quraysh tribe in Mecca, then the Arabian Peninsula, and then to the surrounding rulers, that his monotheism was the only correct religious belief, and that only he is the authorized spokesman for this belief. This was why the sin of shirk, that is polytheism, was so grievous in Islam, because it denied his program. There are at least two problems with Muhammad's message. First, merely preaching monotheism does not guarantee that the monotheism you preach faithfully represents the nature and personality of the living God. Second, it is reasonable for humanity to demand that anybody who claims to have a special access to God as a prophet should be able to provide convincing proof that he has such authority. Unfortunately, Muhammad, when challenged, felt no obligation to provide authentication. Following Muhammad's own conduct, Muhammad's doctrine does not put the onus on Muslims to prove that he was a true prophet, in the same way that, when asked for proof by the Quraysh, Muhammad said, quote, "I have not been sent to you with this," that is, I will not answer your question, "but I have brought to you from Allah the revelation He has sent," end quote. Islamic actors are only required to announce the authority of their prophet, and if resisted can attack, kill, and plunder. And all of this in the name of Allah. This means that Islamic preaching does not consist of any reasoned appeal. It consists only of the announcement, the Shahada. Allah is the only true God, and Muhammad is his true prophet. It is then followed by the invitation. Do you accept this doctrine or no? And if no, it is followed by a jihad. The allowances made for plunder were designed to finance future jihad and motivate would-be jihadis to join up. The theological justification for plunder was and is that since the whole earth is Allah's, anybody who refuses to submit to Allah is in rebellion and forfeits the stewardship of those possessions, which are owned by Allah in the first place. The promise of 72 Uris, that is the heavenly sex slaves, in paradise would be the heavenly booty you collect in case you didn't live to collect the earthly booty, that is the earthly sex slaves that your right hand possesses. Historically and at present, these incentives have worked quite effectively. This emphasis on the material and sensual suggests the human origin of Islam. Now put yourself into the sandals of a person who attends a grove of date trees on the Arabian Peninsula in the year, say, 625 CE. A Muslim army approaches your town and invites you to Islam. You are not an expert in philosophy of religion, you just have your ancestral religion. Representatives from this army tell you that one Muhammad, whom you've never heard of, is the only true prophet, and the religious and legal doctrine defined by him is the only correct one. Your choices are two: obey the teachings of this alleged prophet or be attacked. I suppose that if Allah was indeed the true God, then he need not be very motivated to persuade you that his prophet is the true prophet, or that the doctrine he brings is a true doctrine. He might in that case be a harsh God, but, well, he can do what he wants. And in any case, you are faced with an army prepared to wipe out your town. Not exactly what you would call seeker-sensitive evangelism. If Muhammad was a true prophet of the true God, Allah, then Allah authorizes a style of da'wah, the call, which presents in the form of a demand. Quote, "I put you on this earth to be in submission, Islam, to this set of doctrines which my messenger brings to you. Don't ask about freedom, it is a meaningless concept. Your role is to just be in submission, Islam, to this doctrine. If you can't see it, if you are not convinced of it, if it is incoherent to you, that does not matter. You are to submit," end quote. If you do not submit to this doctrine, you will be killed, only to burn in a place called hell forever. This means that Muhammad put people and peoples in the position of living for one purpose, to obey and enrich him, but to do it under the guise of worshiping a god. The ostensible purpose of Muhammad was to purify the Arabian Peninsula for Allah, the only true God. But the result of Muhammad's career was to launch a worldly empire, the Islamic Empire, whose religious belief happened to be in this Allah. In the present, the ostensible purpose of Islam is to purify the world for Allah, the only true God. But the result of jihad, kinetic and civilizational, is to advance a worldly empire, the Islamic Empire, whose religious belief happens to be in this Allah. The intent of Islam is to advance an empire in which the religion is merely the language, in the same way that the intent of Muhammad was to build an empire in which the religion was merely the language. And in this religion, the collection of taxes happened to be very important. A fifth of all booty from jihad operations, a heavy tribute called jizya from dhimmis, that is, subjugated peoples. By the way, they were allowed to live because their usefulness as a tax base outweighed their refusal to say the Shahada. Taxes from all the peoples of the Arabian Peninsula during Muhammad's lifetime, and heavy taxes on all peoples under Islam throughout its history. Def Shermi, the forcible conscription of boys from dhimmi populations to become soldier slaves for jihad, general slavery, including sex slavery of captured women. Question: is this beginning to look like a worldly empire and not a mere religion? If not, why not? Oh yes, all these people are commanded to obey and worship Allah. They are very religious. But if Muhammad has made himself the gatekeeper to Allah, then you must derivatively worship Muhammad in the process of worshiping Allah. This can be seen in the fact that Muslims must bow 5 times a day toward Mecca. If Allah created the universe, He created the 10 to the 11th power of galaxies, that is 100 billion galaxies of the visible universe, each containing about 100 billion stars. Then what is so special about Mecca? What, does Allah reside there? No. The God who created the universe does not reside in any place. Mecca happens to be the birthplace of Muhammad. Then by bowing 5 times a day to Mecca, Muslims are bowing 5 times a day to the birthplace of Muhammad. So when Muslims bow to Mecca, they are bowing to a mere man. They are worshipping an idol, something Muslims claim not to do. When Muslims circumambulate the Kaaba, they are circumambulating an idol. Then they are worshipping an idol, something Muslims claim not to do. When Muslims kiss the black stone, which is most likely a mere meteorite, they are kissing an idol. In doing this, Muslims are worshipping an idol, something Muslims claim not to do. By force of habit and tradition, Muslims have been conditioned to not see what an outsider can see, namely their idolatry. The disconnect between Muhammad's claim to be preaching a pure monotheism and the actual practices of his religion, which have numerous idolatrous practices, suggests that he was a false prophet. Muhammad's words to the Quraysh were, "Don't ask for evidence, I do not owe it to you." That is what the Quraysh did. Ask for evidence and see what happened to them. What kind of God is it that would give you as your only 2 choices totalitarianism or death followed by eternal hellfire? That these are the only 2 choices presented by Islam, I take to be evidence that it was a doctrine custom-made for tyranny, a doctrine of demons. At least we can say that this is strong evidence that the doctrine Muhammad brought is a mere human doctrine. Therefore, Islam's authority comes only from the threat of force, death, and hell, not from its being true. Toward the end of his career, Muhammad had so thoroughly established his power across the Arabian Peninsula that he had installed his rulership across the peninsula. Tribute was levied from unbelievers, now dhimmis, as well as believers. Tribes came from as far as Yemen, Syria, and Persia to submit themselves to Muhammad. Their submission is evidence that, had they not submitted, they knew that they could expect to be attacked and killed by Muhammad's armies. This state of affairs points to what had been Muhammad's aim all along, the unlimited pursuit of power and wealth. This is the elephant in the room. The religion that Muhammad brought was just the medium and tool for his imperial ambitions. He could have chosen any metaphysic. He just happened to borrow Jewish monotheism because it was easy to set himself up as its spokesman. Because Muhammad was so successful in attacking peoples of the Arabian Peninsula, killing the men, enslaving the women and children, or in subjugating peoples as dhimmis and taking all the possessions as plunder, he began to cast his eyes on the surrounding kingdoms. So Muhammad sent envoys to at least the following rulers: Caesar of Rome, the king of Persia, the Negus of Abyssinia, the Byzantine emperor, the king of Alexandria, the king of Uman, and the king of Bahrain, and to many others. We have at least the letter which Muhammad sent to Heraclius, emperor of Byzantium. We have both the letter and Heraclius' reaction to that letter. We also know that Khosrow too, king of Persia, received a letter from Muhammad, tore it up, and was troubled by it. In all the letters sent to these rulers, the essential message from Muhammad was, "I am the only living prophet of the only true God, Allah. You are invited, translate warned, to accept these two facts. If you do, well for you. If you don't, well, you are warned." He stamped his letters with a stamp which said, "Muhammad, Prophet of Allah." This behavior appears more like the behavior of an imperialist than of a prophet. So Muhammad went from making himself a nuisance and getting run out of Mecca, to returning to take over Mecca, to taking over the Arabian Peninsula, to putting the surrounding rulers on notice that they had better submit to his God, that is, to him, or else. Although he did not personally live to carry out his threat to the surrounding rulers, his followers did. The politically correct view of Muhammad is that he was the founder of a religion. But given the history of his career and the history of 1400 years of jihad, wouldn't it be more accurate to say that Muhammad was rather the founder of an empire? His call for obedience was framed in religious language, but in the end, if the call is a call to obey and pay or die, how is that not simply imperialism, the thing that mere earthly rulers do? By reframing Muhammad's legacy, we can see that Islam was and is just an empire, expanding and contracting over its 1400-year history, but an empire nonetheless. In this way, we see the mere humanity of Islam. Because it is only human and rules by force or fear, Islam is just a tyrant on the world stage. It has no divine right to impose its will on the world as it does, and because it is a tyrant, it, the doctrine and its actors, should be defeated using any means necessary. It should be no surprise then that the West is letting a Trojan horse through its gates. Islam is an empire. It has the aims of an empire. It behaves like an empire. But it presents itself to the world as a religion. This paralyzes the world from acting to protect itself from Islam's imperialism until it's too late. But Islam is just following the script of its perfect example, Muhammad. Muhammad founded an empire. His aim was to advance an empire. When he had acquired sufficient power, he behaved like the ruler of an empire. But when he first approached his victims, his message was superficially the message of a religion. This caused his victims to not see the danger for what it was until it was too late. During Muhammad's career, he had several people killed for the crime of detracting from him. 2 singing women who had the custom of singing songs insulting the Prophet of Islam were killed with their master. A person who had insulted 2 daughters of Muhammad were also killed. Ka'b bin Ashraf, a Jewish poet, wrote verses about Muslims that Muhammad found insulting. He asked his followers, "Who will rid me of this man?" And several volunteered. Al-Ashraf was stabbed to death while fighting for his life. Another one of Muhammad's detractors, Abu Jahl, boasted that he would stomp on Muhammad's neck. He also plotted to kill Muhammad, once with a rock and once by proposing that a member from each tribe run Muhammad through so that the blame could be spread wide enough to deter Muslims from retaliating. At the Battle of Badr, Muhammad got his revenge and killed Abu Jahl. Muhammad's murder of his detractors has now been codified into law. The Islamic law of slander teaches that anything negative spoken about Islam is illegal, even if it is the truth. Defamation of the Prophet is any denial or disrespect spoken or written of Muhammad. It is illegal under Sharia law, even if it is the truth. Further, UN Resolution 1618, as codified by European states, criminalizes criticism of Muhammad and Islam. This means that the Islamic laws of defamation and slander, as adopted by a dignified UN and implemented by left-leaning Western governments, represents a dignified Western civilization which lacks the will to defend freedom of speech. There is nothing particularly divine about killing detractors. It is something tyrants do when the truth is not on their side. This is strong evidence that Muhammad's message is not from a divine being, but just from Muhammad, a tyrant. Muhammad had a total of 13 wives, as many as 9 at once. Khadija, whom he married alone till her death. Aisha, whom he married at age 9. Although in the culture of that day marriage to a 9-year-old girl might not have been a crime, we know better now. Therefore, multiculturalism is false. Zainab, who had been the wife of his freed son Zaid, his freed slave Zaid, who divorced her that she might wed Muhammad. Do you think that Muhammad's power might have played a role in this episode? Sauda, Salama, Hafsa, Habiba, Maimuna, Safiya, who was a captive from the Khaybar. Her husband, Kinana al-Rabi, had been the treasurer of the Banu al-Nadir tribe when they were attacked at Khaybar. When he denied knowing the whereabouts of the treasure, Muhammad had a fire lit on his belly. Nearly dead, Muhammad had his head struck off. Muhammad then took Safiya as war booty, and because of her rare beauty, took her as his literal trophy wife. The expedition was hardly out of town when Muhammad had a tent pitched so he could consummate the marriage. The utter disregard for Safiya in this affair portrays Muhammad less as a prophet and more as a warlord enjoying his war booty, no pun intended. Zainab bint Khuzaima, also called the mother of the poor, because of her compassion. Asma had white spots of leprosy, so Muhammad sent her back to her family. Amra refused to live with Muhammad and so fled to Allah, that is, back to her family. And Jawairiya, who was captive of the Banu Mustalik, she had been the wife of Mustafa bin Safwan, who had been killed by Muhammad's forces in the expedition against the Banu Mustalik. Imagine being forced to marry and have sex with the murderer of your husband. But this was the kind of man Muhammad was. Question: how does Muhammad's practice and sanctioning of polygamy underscore the mere humanity of Islam? Since the number of men since the number of men and women in the world is approximately equal, when a man takes multiple wives, he is in effect taking a wife at another man's expense. Polygamy puts women in competition with each other for the attention of their husband. It is the source of contention. Polygamy devalues women. It reduces them to property. Polygamy is an expression of pride and power. It is a status symbol. It is a man's declaration to the world that he is worthy of more than an ordinary share of the world's resources. The Islamic sources justify Muhammad's having many wives with the argument that he had the sexual virulence of 30 men. This is the stuff of folklore. Yet it is in the Muslim sources. Muhammad put a limit of 4 wives on his male followers. As the saying goes, rank has its privileges. One could say that Muhammad was hypocritical, or one could say that he legislated himself to have more wives as a way of symbolizing his greater power and importance. It is argued that in a certain sense polygamy is not marriage. Yet amazingly, polygamy is argued today by Muslims as a normal way of being, after the perfect example of the Prophet of Islam. Muhammad's polygamy demonstrates the mere humanity of Islam. It also demonstrates that Muhammad was an ordinary man prone to ordinary vices. There is nothing particularly sublime or divine or exemplary about his polygamy. 38. Muhammad courted the Jews until they saw through him. The first way in which Muhammad courted the Jews was to borrow many concepts, narratives, and some of the language from the Jewish religion and to use them as raw materials for the Quran. His modus operandi was to show his would-be victims that his religion came from a long line of established tradition. This was supposed to have the effect of causing people to lower their guard. I suggest that Muhammad could have chosen any sufficiently rich body of tradition as his medium. He chose Jewish monotheism because it was probably the richest and would aid his legitimacy. Also, there were many Jewish tribes living in the Arabian Peninsula, so to market himself, it was natural to choose a worldview that would have widest appeal. His choice of monotheism as his metaphysic was less because it was true than that it carried the most credibility in that cultural milieu. However, Muhammad would consistently revise material from the Jewish sacred literature to suit his political purposes. Muhammad entered into treaties with tribes of the Jews in order to prevent them from interfering with his plans. When it became apparent to Muhammad that the Jews were not going to accept him as their latest prophet in a long line, he demonized them. When Muhammad had acquired sufficient political and military power, he drove all Jews out of the Arabian Peninsula who he did not kill. Muhammad thoroughly demonized the Jews in the Quran. He put a death warrant on the Jews in his writings. He predicted their destruction in his eschatology. He set in motion the anti-Semitism that we now see in Islam. He set in motion an impulse in the Muslim world to bring about the annihilation of the Jews. The night journey was a late attempt to court the Jews. In the night journey, which we've already talked about, Muhammad sought to establish that he was in the line of the Jewish patriarchs and prophets. The Burqa, a fantastic creature, first transported Muhammad to Jerusalem. His encounter with Moses and Moses' concession of Muhammad's superiority was meant to signal that now the world was to understand that the religion he was bringing was superior to Judaism. Muhammad describes himself as more resembling Abraham than any other person. This is meant to signal that he is in the line of Abraham. The image of the heavenly Kaaba is meant to establish that the Kaaba in Mecca is merely an earthly representation of that heavenly Kaaba, which he has now seen firsthand. Its form, as a temple, is meant to parallel the concept of the temple in Jerusalem that Solomon built. Muhammad is borrowing Jewish ideas and hijacking them for his new religion. Earlier, I had shown that the night journey is given as evidence of the supernatural origin of Islam. When the Quraysh hear Muhammad's story of the night journey, they are incredulous. But the account of Muhammad's story has Muhammad convincing Abu Bakr of the truthfulness of his account by accurately describing features of Jerusalem. If one takes a naturalistic view of the account, one can immediately see the messages Muhammad is attempting to signal by his account. When Muhammad first arrived, he was seeking refuge, and when he first arrived in Medina, he was seeking refuge from the Quraysh of Mecca. The Quraysh, Muhammad's clan, were a pagan tribe. Shortly after arriving in Medina, Muhammad drafted the Constitution of Medina. This document was meant to resolve tensions between the Jewish tribes and to forge the relations that were to be between Muslims and the Jews. In this document, all parties are forbidden to give cooperation to the Quraysh, the tribe that had driven Muhammad out of Mecca. This is a conspicuously self-serving stipulation. Even with the Constitution of Medina, it was not long before relations with the Jews of Medina soured. Ibn Ishaq lists the names of many rabbis who openly opposed the claims of Muhammad. They are from the following tribes: the Nadir, the Kenuka, the Qurayza, the Zuraya, the Amr bi Auf, and the Najjar. These tribes Ibn Ishaq takes to have rejected Muhammad's claims. Ibn Ishaq's account tells how one of the Jews, Abdullah bi Salam, aka al-Husayn, was convinced by Muhammad's correct answer to the 3 test questions given to him. But he was the minority. Because the Jews, with few exceptions, rejected Muhammad's claims, it took only 18 months for Muhammad to decide to change the Qibla from Jerusalem to Mecca. I take this to be a signal that Muhammad had determined to forge ahead with a religious identity separate from the Jews. After this break, Muhammad began to come out with his anti-Semitic revelations. The anti-Semitism of Islam deserves a separate study, but it is beyond the scope of this presentation. It has already been studied extensively. Muhammad banished the Banu Kainuka tribe in 624. Muhammad laid siege to the Banu Nadir for 2 weeks before he was able to banish them. This was in 625. Muhammad laid siege to the Banu Qurayza for 25 days before he beheaded the 600 to 900 men plus 1 woman of that tribe in 627. I will not treat the many anti-Semitic teachings in the Quran and the Hadith. It's outside of scope. Jehovah repeatedly promises to have a covenant with the Jews forever in the Torah. In order to hijack the message of the Torah, Muhammad must demonize the Jews and say that they went astray and were abandoned by God, Jehovah, in favor of Islam, of course. This revisionism is very extensive and deserves a separate study. If Jehovah promised to be with the sons of Israel forever, then any prophet who demonizes the sons of Israel can be presumed to be a false prophet. Therefore, Muhammad is a false prophet. The doctrine of abrogation is an admission that Muhammad is a false prophet. The doctrine of abrogation is the interpretive principle in the Quran that the later surahs override the earlier surahs. Bear in mind that the Quran is not written in chronological order. This means that one must use internal markers against external sources to determine the actual chronological order of the surahs. From a naturalistic perspective, the doctrine of abrogation is Muhammad's giving himself permission to change his mind and then codifying it into a theological principle. By elevating his inconsistency into a theological principle, Muhammad is trying to cover his tracks, that is, hide the fact that the whole of the Quran is just his invention, whose ultimate purpose was actually political. 40. Muhammad's belief that women are of inferior intelligence shows that he was a false prophet. There are many ways in which Islam's view of women betray its mere humanity. This deserves separate treatment. For the purposes of this section, I want to show how one of Muhammad's views of women show him to be a false prophet. One of Muhammad's beliefs that controlled his doctrines about women was that he believed that women were of inferior intelligence. But it is well established in modern psychology that women are just as intelligent as men. Therefore, Muhammad was just wrong. Therefore, he is fallible, and fallible in areas which have a huge impact on human relations and social conditions. This principle of Muhammad's, coupled with the many regulations he built on this false assumption, demonstrate that he is a false prophet. 41. The satanic verses demonstrate that Muhammad was a false prophet. In this incident, Muhammad feels pressured to somehow win over his tribe, the Quraysh. After holding fast in his monotheism, Muhammad finally gave in to the Quraysh and came down with a revelation that the Muslims could use the gods of the Quraysh, Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, as intercessors to Allah. This seems clearly to be a concession of political expedience for the beleaguered Muhammad. Shortly thereafter, Muhammad receives a reprimand from Gabriel for the compromise, or, from a naturalistic perspective, Muhammad flip-flopped. This incident shows that Muhammad is not infallible, that he is a false prophet. 42. The Allah knows best argument by Muhammad. In many places in the Quran, Muhammad comes down with a command from his Allah which might be distasteful. For example, in giving the command to wage jihad by the sword, Muhammad says, Jihad is ordained for you, though you dislike it. And it may be that you dislike a thing that is good for you, and that you like a thing that is bad for you. Allah knows, but you do not know. The Allah knows best argument, frequently given by Muhammad, is his way of denying the reality of his hearers, so they will do his bidding, even against their instincts or their humanity. It was a way of victimizing his targets. It is a tool of a false prophet. The Allah knows best argument, as with Muhammad's modus operandi in general, has embedded assumptions. This is how it works. I have something I want you to do. I know you might be squeamish about it. So this thing I want you to do is really coming from Allah, my invisible backup. Allah knows best for you. Allah sees the total picture and you do not. And I also see the total picture. So trust me. If you don't do what I say, what Allah says, you will go to hell and roast forever. If you do what I say, what Allah says, maybe you will go to paradise. But there is one exception. If you die a martyr in jihad, that is a shaheed, you are guaranteed paradise with the Uris, the 72 virgins. Allah will provide. Being a shaheed, you can bypass the knife-edged bridge, which is the trial over the fire which you must otherwise undergo at death. As long as Muhammad has the Muslim convinced that he is really speaking for God, it works. One of the reasons it works is that it pushes all of the rewards until after the victims blow themselves up in a crowded place. And by victims, I mean the Muslims. By the time they discover that there aren't any Uris waiting for them, with grapes in paradise, the con job has worked. This whole modus operandus demonstrates that Muhammad is a false prophet. Okay, 43, assessment. Items 14.1 through 14.27 give some of the signs that are presented in the Islamic texts for believing that Muhammad was the final prophet. The testimony of these events is not particularly convincing. They are untestable. They force the reader to rely on authority. Many of the signs of Muhammad's authority seem clearly time-bound and culture-bound. The trees bending to give shade to the prophet, the angels shading the prophet as he rides. Some of the signs seem less authentications than signals of doctrines Muhammad wants to communicate. That is, his warnings about the Jews, his night journey. Some of the signs are just not believable. The light coming out of Muhammad's mother, the camel with the big teeth, these are just silly. On the negative side, Muhammad exhibits many ordinary human characteristics. We can see that the overarching theme of Muhammad's career is that he was a warlord. He wanted to build an empire. Muhammad's religion was the medium he used to carry out his ambitions. Following the example of its founder, Islam also uses the medium of religion to carry out its worldly ambitions. Muhammad was a very bad man. He was not only a false prophet and led many astray. He was a murderer. He was a highwayman. He waged aggressive warfare under the pretense of purifying the world for Allah, meaning he took it upon himself to murder people who did not see what he saw. Considering the size of the claims that he made for himself and his doctrine, he made little effort to provide proof. Instead, he used force and the threat of death to gain cooperation. This was not really cooperation, but slavery. In a certain sense, it can be said that, as a tyrant, his stance toward the entire world was one of tyranny. He made people his slaves by forcing them to fight his wars. He made people his slaves by giving up their property or their free labor. He made women his slaves by giving up their husbands and their bodies. He drove people out of their homes and cities. He stole their property. He took and kept thousands into slavery. He and his soldiers took many, probably thousands of women as war booty into sex slavery. He should not be regarded as an example of the perfect man that the Quran teaches him to be. His revelations of convenience and of the satanic verses show that he was just speaking for himself, not a deity. Allah was Muhammad's invisible and imaginary source of power. He was clever enough to convince people that his message was true. In the Meccan phase of his career, Muhammad had an uphill battle. During that time, he really had to sell his product. During Mecca, his message was limited. Do as I say or you will go to hell. But once he arrived in Medina and had convinced enough people to pledge fealty to him, he had acquired sufficient political and military power to carry out his ambitions. Now he could say, do as I say or you will go to hell, and I will dispatch you from this world. His principal instrument was the fear of death and the management of savagery. These are the tools of a false prophet who sought to dominate the world. The Quraysh were right. He was a false prophet, and they resisted as long as they could. In the present, the West needs two things to resist world domination by Islam. First, the West must be able to recognize the threat for what it is. It is being blinded by taqiyya, Islamic deception, and by leftist narrative. Second, the West must have the courage to counter this tyranny. As with Hitler, appeasement never works with a bully. Western and Northern Europe have not learned that lesson, and they are likely to lose their national identities as a result. Canada and Australia are in similar danger, but are not as far gone as Europe. Americans have another generation to sleep, while the Muslim Brotherhood quietly does its work as the enemy within. Hopefully, Americans will wake up before the damage becomes irreversible.